So fire and smoke protection features, this is the passive requirements, the firewalls, the fire partitions, the fire ratings of the construction. Again, moving much more into the IBC world, speaking the same language as the rest of the country in terms of some of these terms. The IBC-based classification of fire resistance rated assemblies is coming in. We're going to recognize some additional methods of establishing the fire resistance rating, so proving it up for plan review purposes. Opening protection is now also going to be based on that fire separation distance. So instead of having an absolute rule of 12 feet from the property line, you get to have unprotected openings, and closer than that, you have to have protected openings. There is going to be a finer gradient consistent with the IBC and with some Chicago amendments, especially for residential buildings where we haven't had opening protection requirements before. IBC-based requirements for fire-resistant joints and penetrations. Many people have been building those for insurance reasons or otherwise. They weren't really in our code, but they will come in more consistent, much more consistent with the national standards for that. Similarly, fire-rated doors, windows, other assemblies recognized, so you won't have to translate the relatively out-of-date Chicago provisions to find products that meet them. Prescriptive fire resistance rated assemblies, all of those helpful things at the back of the IBC, Chapter 7, are going to be recognized by us, so there will be less need to go to outside sources to find rated assemblies. And then for special cases with approval, so again, probably the alternative code approval process, we will recognize calculated fire resistance rated assemblies or engineering judgments, but that is going to require someone supervisor level or above in the department to look at that outside of the permit process. The fire resistance requirements for exterior wall protections more clearly spelled out, and there's some very helpful tables that we developed there to make it clear when you have features, porches, balconies, cornices, other things, and how close they are to the lot line, what fire resistance requirements they need to meet. There are some modified opening limitations for low-rise residential buildings, so residential buildings up to 4 stories where we haven't had opening protection required before. There's a modified table for those for Chicago, so if you do that type of building and you read the first table, keep reading because there is a second table on the next page. Some people don't get that far and call with concerns. Firewalls. So firewalls in Chicago will continue to be 4 hours. The idea of the 8-hour firewall in Chicago, which I don't think anyone actually ever built, is gone. But instead of the IBC occupancy-based table of different ratings of firewalls, all firewalls will continue to be 4 hours. But the IBC structural integrity requirement, which is also challenging to meet, is not adopted. So the idea that the wall needs to stay standing when buildings on both sides collapse is not a requirement in our code. So it will continue to allow those firewalls to be offset as you go up through a complicated building. And there's also a new recognition that the Chicago vestibule can go away and you can have 3-hour rated doors and a 4-hour rated firewall if the buildings on both sides of that firewall are protected by sprinkler systems. So I think that will be popular for some projects. The last change highlighted on here is that today our code says that when you have penetrations up to 9 square feet, you just fill the void, you stuff it with non-combustible things and hope it will work. I'm not sure it really works, and so recognizing though that we've had a special rule for that, and there is lesser risk with those smaller shafts. Those will now become something that's required to be enclosed in a 1-hour rated shaft regardless of the height of the building. So not as strict as IBC, but a little bit clearer and probably better performance than our code gets today on those conditions. Here's a little illustration of that condition about the maximum area of openings being based on fire separation distance. So when you're 30 feet away from the property line or closer, if you have protected openings or sprinklered buildings, you can have unlimited area of openings. Closer you get to the property line, the smaller area of openings you can get, and usually in that case you don't want huge openings on your property line. But you also note that at 5 feet from a lot line or 3 feet from a lot line in a building with sprinklers, you can now have openings that are unprotected. So I think whereas Chicago today, if it's a building that requires protected openings, that doesn't happen until you get to 12 feet. So there are some trade-offs. In some areas it gets a little harder, but in some areas it gets a little easier, and I think it will work well for a lot of projects. Interior finishes. This is a chapter in our code today that I think, again, has a lot of differences without really providing a lot of benefits. And so this new chapter, the new replacement requirements for interior finishes, moves much closer to national standards. Many more products are going to meet this chapter off the shelf. There's a few areas where Chicago remains stricter, but the big benefit of this is that the products that are out there, the product reps out there, are going to be able to talk in the language of the standards that this code references, as opposed to our code today, which is using outdated classification systems and plays around with some of the number ratings in a confusing way that probably most people don't follow. Here's the outline of the chapter, the topics it covers, everything from wall and ceiling finishes to trim, insulation, acoustical ceiling systems. As I said, it's going to adopt that standard classification system. There are a few areas, and to highlight them, where Chicago remains stricter, and hopefully people don't want to get too creative with the finishes in these areas. So in enclosed exit stairs and some conditions in lobbies, those are the areas where Chicago remains a little bit stricter than the IBC would allow. Fire protection systems, this is an area where there is a lot of change. So our code today does not require nearly as many active fire protection systems, fire alarms, standpipes, sprinklers, as the national models that are out there. The state fire code, which may or may not apply in Chicago today, depending who you ask. Yeah, that's a joke. There's actually a law going through in Springfield right now that will clear that up. Because they knew we were actually finally updating our code in Chicago, the state fire marshal, unlike the previous state fire marshal who just wanted to fight with us, worked with us, and it should be law by the end of this session that says that there is not double regulation anymore in home rule municipalities like Chicago that have local fire and life safety codes. So if that law passes in Springfield, which we expect it will, it is moving through, there will not be this need to, or question about whether that state fire code, NFPA 101-based state fire code, has to also be followed unless you're doing a state-owned facility. So if you're building for the state, you have to follow their code. Or you're doing a state-regulated facility, primarily daycares, is where it becomes a conflict. So getting into those systems, there's a lot of different systems covered in detail in this chapter. So sprinkler systems, standpipe systems, fire extinguishers, fire alarm and detection, smoke control systems, which you can see in blue. Chicago decided to be a little different there. Fire command centers in high-rise buildings, the fire department connections, carbon monoxide systems, city fire alarm boxes, which are those things that you see out in the street, and I'm not sure anyone thinks they still work, but they do. They have to be put outside theaters, daycare centers, schools, things like that. And I guess if cell phones fail and phones fail, those boxes are still wired to some telegraph-based system that will send a signal somewhere and someone will respond. So significantly expanded requirements for active fire protection systems that we've already covered. So the biggest change is going to be sprinkler systems, I think. In residential buildings with 4 or more units, and that requirement goes into effect January 1st, 2020 for all projects, they will require sprinkler systems. For rehab conditions, existing residential buildings that are being rehabbed, there are exceptions in the code, but if it's a change of occupancy, if you're taking a warehouse and it's going to have 4 more new residential units, or it's a new construction building with 4 more residential units, sprinklers are going to be required in Chicago starting January 1st, 2020. Also, in assembly occupancies, there is going to be some new requirements, and the requirement for office buildings or all other occupancies where there isn't some more specific trigger is going to be buildings over 70 feet. So the high-rise system requirements still come in at 80 feet, but the sprinkler requirement will come in at 70 feet. Fire alarm, standpipe, command center requirements, those are very specific to how the fire department operates, so they made a fair number of suggested amendments to those sections, and there may have a few more. So one of the reasons the code won't be published in the user-friendly book form until October is that this ordinance moved through very fast. We tried to do our best, but when you're doing 776 pages of ordinance in a very short timeline. We knew there were going to be typos and things we didn't get quite right, so we expect there will be a slight cleanup ordinance that probably passes City Council sometime this summer, and that will be reflected in the first set of formally published books before the code goes into effect. So largely, it will be the code that is out there today, the ordinance that's out there today, but there will be a few changes, and I think this is an area where the fire department may have a few more little tweaks that they want to these system requirements. The fire department recognizes that one thing that they don't really permit today, because they aren't required in our code today for most part, is alternative extinguishing systems. So in restaurants, chemical extinguishing systems in cooking hoods or various other systems like that that are a little more specialized come in as code requirements here, and the fire department is working on figuring out what the permitting requirements will be for those systems, hopefully before that goes into effect in December. There are still some specialized requirements that carry over from our current code, so exhibition areas, whether it's McCormick Place size things or smaller exhibition areas that are part of a hotel, and then technology centers become telecommunication equipment areas, and they have some specialized fire protection requirements as well. The electrical code requirements for fire pumps, consistent with the model codes, have actually been relaxed to recognize that now we're going to have many more systems that are smaller than high-rise buildings that have to have active fire protection systems, sprinklers or standpipes, and may need fire pumps to support that based on our low-pressure water system in Chicago. So those electric fire pumps in other than high-rise buildings and hospitals will now not be required to be on the emergency secondary power system, so that will allow resizing some generators for some projects. Carbon monoxide detectors, there's a requirement in our code today that whether or not there's some source of carbon monoxide, assembly occupancies have to have carbon monoxide detection. No one can quite remember why that was written into the Chicago code or what it was for, so that requirement comes out. And then smoke control systems, so that's an area where the fire department wasn't quite comfortable with the sort of technology out there around those systems. We haven't really had those systems other than atriums in our code today. And so most of those requirements are out. They're moved to an optional Appendix S. If they are installed in the system, however, they must comply with that new Appendix S, which is really the sort of, I think, IBC 909 section requirements related to smoke control systems. But as we go through many of the areas where the IBC would require them, pressurized stairs, pressurized elevator lobbies, are not requirements that we're adopting in Chicago. So they really are going to be optional systems driven by a client requirement in most cases other than in atrium conditions. And then city fire alarm boxes, as we mentioned, they're still going to be required as they are today. And we all hope they work and are tested on some basis.